A grandmother, her grandson, and a close friend were driving home through the piney woods of Texas when a massive diamond-shaped object emitting fiery plumes descended ahead of them, forcing them off the road. What happened next became one of the most medically documented and terrifying UFO encounters in history, with physical evidence and government cover-up implications that stunned investigators. It was December 29, 1980, a chilly Friday evening in the rural pine forests of Dayton, Texas, where the winter air carried the scent of damped earth and wood smoke from distant chimneys. Betty Cash was 51 years old, a divorced grandmother with a warm smile and a no-nonsense attitude, working as a hairdresser in nearby Houston, while caring for her 8-year-old grandson Colby and maintaining close friendships in the tight-knit community. On this particular evening, Betty had spent the afternoon with her neighbor Vickie Landrum, a 40-year-old widow and fellow hairdresser who attended the same Baptist church, discussing holiday plans and family matters over coffee. Colby's mother, who was dating Betty's son, had asked Betty to watch the boy while she worked a shift, so the three decided to make an impromptu trip to the local Dairy Queen for ice cream before heading back, a simple outing that should have ended the evening on a sweet note. Around 8:30, as darkness settled over the pine thickets and the temperature dropped to the mid-40s, the trio piled into Betty's 1980 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme, a reliable sedan she had recently purchased. Vickie sat in the front passenger seat, Colby in the back, and Betty at the wheel, navigating the narrow rural road FM 1485 that wound through the dense forest between Huffman and Dayton. The radio played softly, country tunes filling the car as they chatted about Christmas gifts and church events, the headlights cutting through the foggy night air that often blanketed the East Texas woodlands. About halfway to Dayton, around 9 o'clock, Betty slowed the car as they approached a sharp S-curve where the road dipped slightly, her eyes suddenly fixed on something ahead that made no sense in the quiet forest. Hovering low over the road, perhaps 15 to 20 feet above the ground, was a massive diamond or diamond-shaped object, approximately 25 feet long on each side and 20 feet high, its surface glowing with an intense white light that rivaled the sun at midday. The craft was completely silent. No engine roar or mechanical hum, just an oppressive presence that seemed to suck the sound from the surrounding woods. From its underside emanated a fiery plume or exhaust, bright orange and blue flames shooting downward in a steady stream that illuminated the pine trees around it with an otherworldly glow, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the road like flames from a forest fire. Betty slammed on the brakes about 100 feet from the object, the tires screeching as the car came to a halt, all three occupants staring in stunned silence at the impossible sight blocking their path. The diamond-shaped craft appeared metallic, with no visible seams, windows, or markings, its surface smooth and reflective, despite the intense heat radiating from below. Vickie gasped first, her hand flying to her mouth as she whispered, "Betty, what is that?" Colby, wide-eyed in the back seat, pressed his face against the window, torn between fear and fascination at the glowing spectacle. Betty, her practical nature kicking in despite the shock, considered turning the car around, but the narrow road and dense forest on both sides made it impossible without backing up dangerously. As they sat frozen, the object suddenly began to move, ascending slowly and deliberately straight up, the fiery exhaust growing brighter as it gained altitude, the heat waves distorting the air around it like a mirage in the desert. Before Betty could react, a deafening roar filled the air, not from the craft itself, but from a formation of military helicopters that appeared from behind the trees, approaching from the northwest in a tight diamond pattern. There were approximately 16 to 18 helicopters, Betty later estimated, a mix of single and double rotorcraft she identified as CH-47 Chinooks and Bell UH-1 Hueys based on shapes she had seen in news footage of Vietnam operations. The helicopters seemed to be escorting or pursuing the diamond-shaped object, some flying close formation around it, while others circled at a distance, their rotors thumping rhythmically in the night air, the combined noise creating a wall of sound that vibrated through the car windows.
The fiery object continued its ascent, moving slowly eastward parallel to the road at about 20 miles per hour, the helicopters maintaining position around it as if herding or containing the unknown craft. Betty, her heart pounding, decided they had to follow at a safe distance to get out of the isolated area, fearing the intense heat and radiation they could feel even from 100 yards away. She put the car in gear and began driving slowly behind the formation, keeping the glowing object and helicopters in sight through the windshield, the road curving slightly to follow their path. The heat was palpable, seeping through the car's ventilation system despite the windows being closed, making the interior feel like a sauna as sweat beaded on their foreheads. After about 3 miles of this eerie procession, the diamond-shaped object suddenly accelerated dramatically, shooting upward and eastward at incredible speed, disappearing into the night sky within seconds, leaving the helicopters to disperse in different directions, some continuing east while others veered north and south. Betty accelerated to get home faster, the encounter lasting approximately 20 minutes in total, though it felt like hours to the shaken trio. They arrived at Betty's home in Dayton around 10 o'clock, pulling into the driveway where the normalcy of the suburban street felt surreal after what they had witnessed. As they stepped out of the car, the first signs of trouble appeared. The Oldsmobile's exterior was unusually hot to the touch, the door handles burning their palms, and the interior upholstery had begun to melt slightly around the edges where the seats met the frame. Betty's hands, which had gripped the steering wheel tightly during the sighting, were already red and blistered, the skin inflamed as if burned by hot metal. Vickie helped Colby inside while Betty stumbled to her kitchen, running cold water over her hands, but the pain only intensified, her skin turning bright red and swelling rapidly. Colby began vomiting almost immediately, his small body racked with nausea, while Vickie developed a burning sensation in her eyes and throat, her scalp tingling painfully as if her hair were being pulled from the roots. If you're already gripped by the terrifying details of the Cash-Landrum encounter, please subscribe to America's UFO Legacy, because we uncover these documented, evidence-backed UFO cases every week, complete with witness testimonies, medical reports, and government investigations. And your support helps us continue sharing these crucial stories from American history's most mysterious skies. Within hours, all three were seriously ill, their symptoms escalating through the night. Betty suffered third-degree burns on her hands, face, and scalp, losing chunks of hair and developing diamond-shaped welts on her skin that matched the UFO's shape. Vickie experienced severe eye inflammation, nausea, and diarrhea. And Colby, the most vulnerable, suffered hair loss, vomiting, and skin lesions that required pediatric care. Betty drove herself to the emergency room around midnight, where doctors initially diagnosed her with heat exhaustion or allergic reaction, prescribing painkillers and ointments, but her condition worsened dramatically over the next days, requiring multiple hospital stays for radiation-like burns, immune system failure, and gastrointestinal damage that baffled medical professionals. The physical evidence from the car was equally alarming. The Oldsmobile's interior showed melted plastic and vinyl where no heat source should have existed. The steering wheel and gear shift discolored and warped. An independent analysis later revealed elevated radiation levels on surfaces the three had touched most. The military helicopters they described were real and active in the area, with Huffman Heliport used for classified operations. But when Betty and Vickie contacted the Army and NASA for answers, they were met with denials and stonewalling, fueling suspicions of a secret weapons test gone wrong or experimental aircraft that caused unintended radiation exposure.
The women's determination to seek justice and answers would lead to a groundbreaking lawsuit against the U.S. government, making the Cash-Landrum incident not just a UFO encounter, but a legal battle that exposed gaps in government accountability for unexplained aerial phenomena. The burning pain that started in Betty Cash's hands that night quickly spread through her entire body, turning what should have been a simple evening drive into a medical nightmare that doctors couldn't explain and the government refused to acknowledge. The Cash-Landrum incident would expose not just the terror of UFO encounters, but the dark underbelly of military secrecy and civilian suffering in the pursuit of unknown technology. By the time Betty pulled into her driveway just after 10 o'clock, the initial shock of the encounter was giving way to physical agony that no one could have anticipated. Her hands throbbed with an intensity that made her gasp, the skin already reddening and blistering as if she had plunged them into boiling water, though the steering wheel had felt only warm, not hot, during the sighting. Vickie, helping the vomiting Colby from the back seat, noticed her own skin tingling, a strange prickling sensation across her arms and face, and her eyes burned as if exposed to chemical fumes. Colby, pale and retching on the front lawn, clutched his stomach, his small body shaking with chills despite the mild Texas night.
Betty fumbled with her keys, the metal biting into her inflamed palms, and they stumbled inside, the normalcy of the living room television and family photos mocking the surreal horror they had just escaped. Betty headed straight for the kitchen sink, turning on the cold water and thrusting her hands under the stream, but instead of relief, the pain intensified, sharp and stabbing like needles piercing her skin. She cried out, pulling her hands away, only to see the water turning pink as blisters formed rapidly, the skin swelling and separating in patches that looked like severe sunburn but felt like third-degree burns. Vickie got Colby a bowl for his nausea and called his mother, explaining they were all feeling sick after the weird lights they saw, but she downplayed the severity to avoid alarming her. As the minutes ticked by, Vickie's symptoms worsened. Her eyelids swelled shut, forcing her to squint through painful slits, and a metallic taste filled her mouth, accompanied by waves of dizziness that made the room spin. Colby's vomiting continued, each heave bringing up nothing but bile, his scalp itching unbearably as if something were crawling beneath his skin. Betty, recognizing the seriousness, decided they needed medical help, but pride and fear of sounding crazy kept her from calling an ambulance. Instead, she drove herself to the Parkway Hospital emergency room in Houston around midnight, a 30-minute drive that felt eternal as she gripped the wheel with bandaged hands, tears streaming down her face from the pain. At the ER, the on-duty doctor, puzzled by Betty's symptoms, initially diagnosed heat exhaustion or an allergic reaction, noting the blistering on her hands, face, and neck, but finding no obvious cause like chemical exposure or fire. He prescribed painkillers, antibiotics, and burn cream, sending her home with instructions to rest. But by morning, her condition had deteriorated dramatically. The blisters had burst, leaving raw, weeping wounds that oozed clear fluid, and diamond-shaped welts appeared on her forehead and cheeks, exactly mirroring the UFO's shape they had seen, a detail that would later intrigue investigators but horrified Betty when she saw her reflection. Her hair began falling out in clumps, not gradually, but in painful patches, as if burned at the roots, and she developed a high fever, nausea, and diarrhea that left her dehydrated and weak. Vickie, staying with Colby at Betty's house, fared slightly better, but still suffered swollen eyes, scalp tenderness leading to partial hair loss, and gastrointestinal distress that confined her to bed. Colby, the youngest and most vulnerable, was hit hardest. His vomiting persisted for days, his skin erupted in red rashes, and he lost significant hair, requiring pediatric care where doctors scratched their heads at the radiation-like symptoms in an 8-year-old with no known exposure. Word of their illness spread quickly in the small community, and by Saturday morning, friends and family rallied. But the women's real ordeal began when they started connecting their symptoms to the fiery object they had seen. Betty, bedridden and in agony, confided in a neighbor about the spaceship and helicopters,
a story that quickly reached local reporter Carol Leake at the Houston Post. Leake interviewed them on December 30th, capturing their consistent accounts despite the pain medication clouding their minds. The massive diamond craft, the intense heat, the military helicopters, and the immediate onset of symptoms. Her article, published January 2, 1981, titled UFO Terrorized Trio, brought national attention, prompting calls from UFO researchers, skeptics, and government agencies alike. The women's credibility was immediately apparent. Betty and Vickie were upstanding citizens, churchgoers with no history of fabricating stories, and Colby's innocent terror added heartbreaking authenticity. Their car, impounded for examination, revealed undeniable physical evidence. The interior dashboard and seats showed melted vinyl and plastic in irregular patterns consistent with intense, localized heat. The steering wheel discolored and warped, and radiation detectors registered elevated beta and gamma levels on surfaces they had touched, particularly the driver's side, readings that suggested exposure to a radioactive source far beyond normal background radiation. UFO investigators descended on Dayton, led by the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization and prominent researcher Peter Brooksmith, who documented the case meticulously. They took soil samples from the sighting site, finding scorched pine needles and elevated radiation in a small area where the craft had hovered, though the evidence was circumstantial due to the weeks that had passed.
The women's medical records were obtained with permission, revealing symptoms strikingly similar to acute radiation syndrome: erythema, skin reddening, epilation, hair loss, nausea, and immune suppression, conditions typically seen in nuclear accident victims or Hiroshima survivors. Betty endured 16 days in the hospital across multiple admissions, her burns requiring skin grafts, her white blood cell count plummeting to dangerous levels, and her eyesight temporarily impaired by what doctors called radiation keratitis. Vickie suffered similar but less severe effects, while Colby's pediatrician noted his symptoms mimicked those of children exposed to fallout from atomic tests. If this detailed account of the Cash-Landrum physical evidence is captivating you, please subscribe to America's UFO Legacy, where we deliver these thoroughly researched UFO encounters weekly, backed by medical reports, witness testimonies, and declassified documents, ensuring the truth about these historic cases reaches those who seek it most. The military denials began almost immediately, with the Army, Air Force, and NASA issuing statements that no helicopters or experimental craft were in the area that night, despite the women's detailed descriptions matching known military hardware. The CH-47 Chinooks and UH-1 Hueys were standard equipment at nearby Ellington Field and Bergstrom Air Force Base. When pressed, officials claimed weather conditions prevented flights, but aviation logs later subpoenaed in the lawsuit showed multiple helicopter operations in the region, though none admitted to the specific formation the women described. This stonewalling fueled suspicions of a cover-up, with researchers speculating the fiery diamond was a failed nuclear-powered aircraft prototype, perhaps the Aurora project or secret anti-gravity vehicle tested under Reagan's Star Wars initiative, its malfunction causing unintended radiation release on civilians. Betty and Vickie, refusing to be silenced, filed a federal lawsuit on April 6, 1982 against the U.S. government under the Federal Tort Claims Act, seeking damages for medical expenses, lost wages, and pain and suffering, represented by Houston attorney Peter Gersten and supported by UFO advocate Peter Laflamme. The suit alleged negligence in operating an experimental craft that exposed them to harmful radiation, citing the melted car interior, medical diagnoses, and witness statements as evidence. The legal battle dragged on for years, with the government mounting a vigorous defense, claiming sovereign immunity and denying any involvement, while subjecting the women to grueling depositions that questioned their sanity and motives. Expert witnesses for the plaintiffs included nuclear physicists who analyzed the car and confirmed radiation exposure consistent with a nuclear propulsion system, but the government's experts dismissed the findings as inconclusive, attributing symptoms to stress or pre-existing conditions. Colby's testimony, given through drawings and simple words, was particularly poignant, his childlike fear cutting through the courtroom tension. The case highlighted the plight of UFO witnesses seeking accountability, exposing how government secrecy could leave civilians suffering without recourse. In 1986, the court ruled against them, finding insufficient evidence to prove government involvement, a decision that devastated Betty, who by then was permanently disabled, her hands scarred and arthritic, her health never fully recovering. Vickie fared better physically, but carried emotional scars, while Colby grew up with questions about the fire in the sky that marked his childhood. The Cash-Landrum incident's legacy extends beyond the personal tragedy, becoming a benchmark for UFO cases with physical effects and military connections. Investigations by MUFON and others uncovered similar sightings in Texas that December, including reports of low-flying helicopters and strange lights near military bases, suggesting a larger operation. Declassified documents from the 1980s, released under FOIA, show internal memos debating the case's validity, with some officials privately acknowledging the radiation evidence but publicly maintaining denials. Skeptics proposed alternatives like a magnesium flare or weather balloon, but none explained the medical symptoms, car damage, or helicopter formation. Betty passed away in 1998 at age 69, her death certificate listing complications from chronic illness linked to the exposure, while Vickie lived until 2012, always insisting the government knew more than it admitted. Colby's life was forever shaped by the event, channeling his experience into advocacy for UFO disclosure. The case ignited debates about national security versus civilian rights, influencing later legislation like the 1997 U.S. Senate hearings on UFOs and the 2021 Pentagon UAP report that acknowledged unexplained aerial phenomena. It demonstrated that UFO encounters could leave tangible, verifiable evidence, challenging the dismissal of witnesses as delusional. The melted Oldsmobile, preserved as evidence, stands as a silent witness in UFO archives, its warped interior a testament to energies beyond known technology. As we reflect on the Cash-Landrum women's courage, their story reminds us that the pursuit of truth about the skies can come at personal cost, demanding accountability from those who operate in secrecy. What do you think caused the radiation exposure that night? Extraterrestrial craft, secret military experiment, or something else? Share in the comments, as these cases thrive on collective exploration.